Hello and welcome to this video blog on Diffractive Pedagogies, dancing across new materialist imaginaries. Our key concepts for this video blog are transdisciplinary, diffractive, unlearning, and zone of proximal development. And all will be revealed as we go through the slides. So our first concept is transdisciplinary, and I'm using Leonardo da Vinci as an example of a transdisciplinary practitioner. So as well as being a scientist and an artist, Leonardo da Vinci invented lots of new things that hadn't even been imagined before, such as flying machines, instruments of war, and industrial engineering. So another example, a more modern example of a transdisciplinary artist would be David Bowie, and he was, as well as being a singer and a musician, he was also a dancer, worked in fashion, and also an actor, as we see from these images. He was also a bisexual performer and pushed the boundaries for bisexual people at the time. Another example would be Idris Elba, who, as well as being an actor and a DJ, has some work with the Prince's Trust and also has worked with the UK government on the Ebola crisis in East Africa. So putting together a range of different disciplines in a new way. Then we might look at Grace Jones, who was born in Jamaica, and she's primarily a musician and performer, but has also worked as an actor in a James Bond film and works and works in fashion. And I saw her in a performance at a festival last year, and she came on for every single song wearing a different outfit, and she really felt like she was pushing the boundaries of what a performance looks like for a musician. And finally, another example of a transdisciplinary artist would be Amira Sackett, who is a dancer and choreographer and uses her work to address political issues of the time. In her recent work, We're Muslim Don't Panic, Amira and two of her friends who wear hijab do a hip-hop body-popping performance wearing niqab, and she's very much interested in addressing the idea of why people wear hijab and niqab and what it means for them. And I've added a video of their performance on learn.gold, which I would highly recommend that you watch. So now let's move on to a general definition of what transdisciplinary means. If we first of all look at this graphic, we can see that a discipline is something that someone does in some ways, for example a musician or an artist. Multidiscipline might mean working in two different disciplines separately. Interdisciplinary might mean connecting two different disciplines in your works, that little yellow space in the middle. And finally, transdisciplinary means connecting two different disciplines and creating something new perhaps, which kind of hovers above the connection. If we now look at the verbal definition, we could see transdisciplinary learning as an exploration of a relevant issue or problem, and of course that's what many of us are doing when we address freedom and control. And this integrates the perspectives of multiple disciplines in order to create new knowledge and deeper understanding. So going back to the article now, one of the main points that's made in the article is that creativity is more likely with a transdisciplinary approach. So I'm going to stop speaking for a moment now so you can read these quotes, and when you've done that, please unpause the video. Good, so now on this next slide we can see exactly how this course tries to offer a transdisciplinary approach by using a range of different methodologies to explore creative production using visual, audio, film and performance-based media. And it is to this end that we suggest, say the authors, that arts-based curricula ought to employ a combination of media such as the moving image, sound, movement and conceptual thinking. So the conceptual thinking element there might refer to the way we're thinking about creativity. We're putting together theories on creativity with a range of different practices such as visual art, movement, sound and film. Now at the end of this quote it says that such progressive strategies can be alienating for those who expect a traditional curriculum. And I'd like to just log that and we'll come back to that idea later in the show. So moving on, let's just go back and review what we've found so far. We've covered transdisciplinary practitioners through this image, and now we'll move on to our second image of diffraction. So diffraction or diffractive means a spreading out of sound or light waves, as you can see through these two images. Now in terms of diffractive pedagogies, which is in the title of this article, we could see that as a spreading out of what counts as knowledge and learning by looking for many different answers or interpretations rather than just one. And we could say that this acknowledges the many different life experiences and ways of learning and communicating that different people have. So now let's look at some quotes from the article which address this. First of all, we could say that a diffractive reading resists the hierarchization of one type of meaning over another. So this would mean that any way of expressing yourself is equally valid and it's not just one type of meaning that is prioritized. Another way of saying this would be that it gives voice to a multiplicity of learner subjectivities. And we could say that in another way by saying it gives voice to a diverse range of different people. And thirdly, we could say that the article says that rather than viewing theory as something to be read or applied, we see our students as creating, producing and theorizing through the production of movement. So going back to the first quote, rather than putting reading and writing at the top of the hierarchy of what counts as meaning, we can say that through movement, it's another way of creating, producing and theorizing. So that will be explained more as we go along. So that covers our first two areas of transdisciplinary and diffractive. Moving on to the third idea of unlearning, represented by Master Yoda. So Yoda's from the Star Wars films, and he says in the film to Luke Skywalker, "You must unlearn what you have learned," in a voice that's nothing like that. And we can connect this with the article where it says on page 223, to learn creatively, students have to unlearn their drive to find the right answer. So the article suggests that the desire to find a right answer is learned through a pre-university education system, so like schools and colleges, that is purported to spoon-feed students so they can pass exams. And the proposition of unlearning this attitude to knowledge acquisition can be embedded in the use of dance as a methodology for teaching and learning creative processes in higher education. And it also goes on to say this is highly challenging for some students. So remember we talked about the alienating thing. It's highly challenging for some students as they're asked to engage with significant processes of unlearning in order to participate. So the article is suggesting that you've all been taught to learn, just find the right answer in school and college on the whole, and now you're going to have to try and find many different answers, not just the one right answer, and dance is going to help you do that, but it might be a bit challenging along the way. Now Ken Robinson, who we've read about earlier in the course, he has this quote which relates to this in a talk that he does. And he says that we're educating people out of their creative capacities. I believe this passionately, that we don't grow into creativity, we grow out of it, or rather, we get educated out of it, says Ken Robinson. So this is the idea that we start off, if you remember in the talk, this is the idea of diverse thinking, and young children are able to think of many different uses for a paperclip in a famous experiment, and as we get older, we get less good at thinking of diverse ways in which things can be used. We just look for the one right answer. So this is kind of connecting that earlier Ken Robinson work with this, with the article now. We'll stay with Ken Robinson for a moment, as he says, he talks about disembodied learning. Now he says in the same talk, he says, truthfully, what happens is, as children grow up, we start to educate them progressively from the waist up, and then we focus on their heads and slightly to one side. There's something curious about professors in my experience. Not all of them, but typically they live in their heads. They live up there and slightly to one side. They're disembodied, in a kind of literal way. They look upon their body as a form of transport for their heads, don't they? It's a way of getting their heads to meetings. So, in this quote, Ken Robinson is saying that we have quite an disembodied idea of what counts as knowledge. It's all about what thinking and what goes on in the head and reading and writing and that sort of stuff, and it's not really about the whole body. So, to sum up all of this topic, we could say that in this module there are two things we might find ourselves unlearning. Firstly, the desire to find one right answer, and instead look for many different answers. And secondly, the idea that knowledge is something we read and write about, so rejecting that idea in favour of the idea that there's ways of drawing, moving, filming and sounding about our knowledge, particularly about creative learning. Okay, so just to recap, we've covered transdisciplinary practitioners, which is what we're doing on this course. We've covered diffractive pedagogies, looking for many different answers rather than one right answer. And we've covered unlearning, which is the idea that we're going to have to unlearn some stuff on this course, and it might be quite challenging. So finally, we move on to the zone of proximal development, which I think you may have come across in some other modules you're doing, which was come up with by Vygotsky. Two little images here, and it's kind of, there's some things you can do all on your own on the left-hand side. There's things you can't do no matter how much support you get on the right-hand side, but there's this juicy, fertile bit in the middle, which is things you can do with a bit of help. And the teacher's role is to support the students, scaffold the learning, to mean they can start to learn to do those things in the middle by themselves. And then moving to the image on the right, that takes this idea into a physical manifestation where you have the teacher's role as being a scaffold or a support or some steps in order that the student can reach higher and pluck the fruits of learning that they otherwise would not be able to reach. So now let's return to the article, and we can see how this relates to what we've talked about so far, because the first quote says it can be a struggle to devise a curriculum that contains enough challenge to be engaging, but not so much as to be alienating. So we want to be in that little middle place between challenge and comfort. I'm going to stop speaking for a moment, and you can pause the video to read this next quote. So what this is saying really is that it's my job to design the activities in such a way that everyone hopefully is in this nice place where they can learn enough challenge for it not to be boring, but not so challenging that it makes you feel too uncomfortable. So there's ways in which we can do that. Firstly, the article says we can the translation of abstract and textual knowledge into creative experimentation needs to be modelled in taught sessions. So it's my job to model that and join in, which I will. The next idea is that if we provide parameters through a theme, it can better afford creative and experimental responses to delimited tasks. So the contrasting ideas of freedom and control, which you're all familiar with, can provide a focus for several weeks of work using paint, movement and drawing as exploratory media. So actually, by providing limits or parameters to your creative task, by giving you a theme which is specific but broad, that will hopefully support your creative work. Now again, the next quote I'd like you to read, and I'll pause the video and you can pause the video and unpause it when you've done. Now when it says warm up here, my approach is to use games at this time, so it's often very fun, everyone tends to have a very good time. There will be other times where it's more kind of focused solo work, and we might use some of these rules about focusing on yourself at this time and not on other people. And another way in which this course is specifically designed to make everyone feel comfortable is the great freedom you've got in the way you make your film. So let's look at this quote. Some students might choose a narrative sequence in which the identity of performers is revealed, for example, whilst others might use techniques of abstraction in order to conceal the identity of the dancers or the movers. So preserving the freedom to make such decisions in your films is important, as this enables students to explore their movements in ways which sit comfortably with their developing identity constructions, thus avoiding situations in which the curriculum and the expected outcomes determine a particular approach that could be uncomfortable or counterproductive for some. So basically what it's saying is that you can make your film in any way you want, and because of that you can make it in a way which suits you and your group. And then a quote later on says that adopting a transdisciplinary process, one can set specific yet flexible goals for students. So you have a specific goal, but you can do it in any way you like. Okay, so back to our cover sheet, and we have transdisciplinary approaches, diffractive learning, unlearning, that there's no more than one answer, and the zone of proximal development to make all of this a good learning experience for everyone. And now introducing a new concept, the final one of, we could call this artistic voice or learner subjectivities. So, learner subjectivities, we could describe that by saying we all have our own subjectivities, which refers to how our judgment is shaped by our own biographies, our own life experiences and personal feelings, and that's why we all have different tastes in the sort of art we enjoy. So taking a quote from the article on page 218, it says that many young people in Britain are negotiating complex self-constructions of multifaceted identities, sometimes navigating a path between family tradition and contemporary urban life. So having taught on the course for a number of years, I've found this to be the case. I find that people are, when they approach the subject of freedom and control, often they're addressing matters of identity and sort of navigating this balance between family and where they've come from, their roots, and where they are now as a person in contemporary urban life. Let's go a bit deeper. Later in the article it says, in thinking about these processes of teaching through arts-based curricula, the philosophical concept of difference is particularly useful because it helps to interrogate the conceptual formations or roots of identity and power. Not so much in terms of difference between cultures as in terms of difference within the same culture. So here we all are within the same culture of the UK, but yet we find lots of differences, subtle differences between our different identities. And I almost feel that the task of addressing freedom and control brings up lots of different things, but often the roots of identity and power are there underlying the things that we find ourselves talking about. And at the bottom it says we might address questions such as, this is in the article, how can creativity operate transculturally, so mixing different cultures and above culture, in a pluri-ethnic, multi-ethnic, diverse society at a time of increasing racism and xenophobia, which has come up in some of your presentations last week. So you can see that all of this is kind of coming together in your own artistic voice and your own specific message that's coming through as you address freedom and control. So we move on to our conclusion, and we'll do one quote from the article and then a summary. So the quote goes, in our view, the difficulty with conservative or traditional fine art curricula is that they do not sufficiently allow either the traditional student or the student new to art to become distinctive. However, a curriculum that focuses on an embodied understanding of creativity, so doing creativity as we're doing in these classes, seems to be the most productive way forward in terms of developing students' sense of singularization, expression and becoming. So I would say all those three terms kind of can be summed up by artistic voice, your unique voice, your expression and who you are becoming through this work. And so now back to a brief summary by me. A transdisciplinary approach supports a diffractive view of what counts as knowledge, helping students to unlearn a drive to find the right answer through the zone of proximal development and exploring their own learner subjectivities and developing an embodied understanding of creativity. So that's the whole of this video, and I hope it has been helpful and that you understand the article more now than you did at the beginning. Bye for now.